This is lesson number 18 in our study of the case for biblical Christianity. In the previous lesson, I presented some of the evidences regarding the Earth's relatively young age. And of course, this is in contrast to the claims of evolutionists who say that the Earth is very, very old. I have already presented some evidences that the Earth can't be as old as evolutionists say it is. And I was discussing at the end of the previous lesson the carbon-14 dating method. There are other dating devices or methods used in trying to establish the dates of things. And Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. John Whitcomb, in their book, The Genesis Flood, give a good presentation on all of these so-called dating devices or dating methods. And I recommend that you read these and see for yourself how that oftentimes these claims are misleading and that these dating methods are not dependable. And sometimes they contradict each other even. And we need to be aware of this and not just accept something just because somebody says it is so. Now, I have respect for true science, and scientists oftentimes, even though they tell us many things that are definitely right and good, sometimes, however, scientists just express opinions. And that's what they're doing when they talk about evolution. That is merely a guess, an opinion, as we've noted in previous lessons. I want to continue now some of the other evidences that the Earth is relatively young. And the number 5 in this presentation, that is, of evidences of a relatively young Earth, are the fossilized trees that have been observed in the Earth's crust. I have talked with people on a number of occasions. I think particularly of 2 places where I've lectured on the subject, and I've lectured in many, many places on this subject all over the land for many, many years, about 1/3 of a century, in fact. And I remember in 2 places, one near Knoxville, Tennessee, and another at Pikeville, Kentucky. And these places, of course, are surrounded by coal mines. And I remember on 2 occasions, after having heard me speak on this very matter, there were those who came and said, I can show you fossilized trees in the mines that are extended through several layers of strata. Now, these phenomenon are presented in various books, and various scientists have told us about these. You remember I referred to Dr. Emanuel Velikovsky in the previous lesson, and Dr. Velikovsky tells us about such fossilized trees, especially in England. And Dr. Rupke of the Netherlands, a great scholar and scientist, has written concerning some of these fossilized trees. A number of scientists have, and they're something that can be observed all around the world, where fossilized trees, some of them with the tops down and some with the tops up, but they extend through more than one layer, in fact, several layers of strata. And the layers are supposed to represent long, drawn-out periods of geological time. But the evidence is that there was catastrophic action, that there was the action of water, and that in this cataclysmic action, these trees were placed in various positions, some of them vertical, some of them horizontal, and in many places they're standing up through several layers of strata, which means that they were fossilized quickly, not gradually. It's unthinkable that a tree would stand for millions of years while sediment is building up around it in the various later layers of strata. So fossilized trees indicate that the earth is not as old as evolutionists claim that it is. And then there's number 6 in this list of reasons why we can question the claims of evolutionists regarding the age of the earth. Number 6 is the tree pollen argument. Tree pollen, which means the dust or the reproductive cells from the male flowers of a tree, the male part of flowers, this tree pollen has been found fossilized in strata around the world. And allegedly, it's supposed to be millions of years older, according to the timetable of evolutionists, than the strata of the first trees that have been found. Well, of course, that creates a very serious problem, doesn't it? To say that here's tree pollen in strata that precedes by millions of years the strata containing the first trees. So that would cause us to question the claims of the long drawn-out time theory of evolutionists. The number 7 argument concerns William Meester, who conducted a store, or was the proprietor of a little market or store out in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he sold mementos, souvenirs, and so on. And he sold, among other things, trilobite fossils. Now, trilobite fossils are fossils of creatures that allegedly lived nearly 500 million years ago and eventually became extinct. So we're talking about creatures that lived millions upon millions of years before man evolved. If you say that trilobites all became extinct even around 400 million years ago, that's nearly 400 million years before man evolved, according to the evolutionary timetable. But Mr. Meester ran out of trilobite fossils and went up to find some more in the mountains in Utah. And at Antelope Springs, Utah, he found some more. In fact, he found some trilobite fossils as he digged in the rock, and they were there in the same strata with 7 human footprints. And that created a tremendous problem. You note that evolutionists never refer to such phenomena. This phenomenon would be devastating to the evolutionary hypothesis. For human footprints and trilobite fossils to be in the same strata. But William Meester found them, and this has been verified by Dr. Melvin Cook, professor of metallurgy at the University of Utah. He has confirmed these tracks. Many years ago, about 17 years ago, I suppose, some of us presented a program at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Dr. Clifford Burdick, Walter Lang, and someone else whose name escapes me, and I myself presented lessons on evidences of Christianity, and especially showing the false claims of evolution. My lecture was on what I'm talking about now, evidences of a young earth. I well recall meeting Dr. Clifford Burdick that day, who presented a lesson, a lecture. I had read about him for many years. He's a geologist, and it was a pleasure, of course, to meet him and to hear his lecture. And in his lecture, he presented the things that I'd already read about, but he had some slides that he showed on a screen of these 7 footprints that William Meester found at Antelope Springs, Utah. He showed the pictures of these footprints. And very generously, Dr. Burdick said that if he had found just one human footprint, we might concede that it was just a freak of nature. But he said there were 7 of them. And that furthermore, whoever made the footprints had shoes on his feet, which of course not only shows that man was there, but whoever it was cultured enough to wear shoes. So this is a problem for the timetable of evolutionists, and you can see why, which would cause us to think that the evolutionists are wrong in their timetable, that all this imagination about a long Earth history, so long that evolution has occurred, is upset by such phenomena as 7 human footprints in strata with trilobite fossils. Then number 8 in the list of arguments is an iron pot. I-R-O-N, iron pot, in a large lump of coal in Wilburton, Oklahoma, that was discovered in 1912. They had carried the coal from Wilburton over to another town near there, Thomas, Oklahoma, and it was to be used and was used in the electrical generating plant there, the Municipal Electric Company in Thomas, Oklahoma. And one of the lumps of coal was so large that 2 of the men that were working there at the Municipal Electric Company and keeping the furnace fired with coal, they had to take a sledgehammer and break this large lump of coal open. And when they did, to their amazement, they found inside it a pot made out of iron. And of course that is not consistent with the claims of evolutionists who say that coal was formed very slowly over long ages of time. And now there are indications that that isn't at all necessary. And that is that it could have been formed, and obviously was formed, rapidly in such cataclysmic actions as took place in the time of the Genesis flood. And certainly an iron pot wouldn't have been there millions upon millions of years ago. But in connection with that, number 9 argument is that coal has been formed rapidly in the laboratories. Dr. George Hill of the College of Mines and Mineral Industries in the University of Utah and his colleagues made coal in about an hour, one report says, from vegetation using the conditions that would simulate the conditions that would have existed in the universal flood. And if you'd like to read more about that, you could read from Chem Tech, C-H-E-M, capital C-H-E-M, and then capital T-H-E-C-H, the May 1972 edition, page 296. Of course, this is not the only place this has been recorded, but there have been several writings on this subject showing that coal then certainly could have been formed suddenly and rapidly in the cataclysmic actions that have taken place in the Earth's crust, like during the Genesis flood, earthquakes and so on, and especially under great pressure that would have existed at the time of the Genesis flood with so much water. And it's already been conceded that coal obviously was formed in rapid time and with the formation being made or with the rapid motion of water. Number 10 argument concerns what the scientists call stalactites and stalagmites. I'm sure you've heard of these and perhaps you've seen some of them when you visited on tours in various places like in caves where they explain how 1 inch is formed in 1,000 years on a stalactite or a stalagmite. Now, it's easy to say this, but of course nobody can prove that that is true. There are evidences that show that it isn't true, and we want to note some of these. For example, in Carlsbad Cavern, they found a stalagmite, and incidentally, the stalagmite is the one that's on the floor of the cave, and the stalactite is the one that hangs from the ceiling. And so in Carlsbad Cavern, they found this stalagmite on the floor of part of the Carlsbad Caverns, and it is shown in the National Geographic magazine. There's a picture of it. October 1953 edition, page 442, and the story was by Mason Sutherland. And it shows how this bat, the carcass of a bat, the little mammal that flies like a bird, the carcass of this bat is embedded a good ways down from the top of the stalagmite, which means that it isn't possible. If a person could believe that that bat's carcass laid there 1,000 years for an inch of sediment to form around it, he could believe anything. And it is obvious that it wasn't very long in its formation. The bat carcass is there to see right in the stalagmite, embedded in it, a good piece from the top of it. And then the Lincoln Memorial, for example, in Washington, D.C., which was built in 1923. That hasn't been very long ago, just 2 years longer, or 2 years before I was born when it was built. And there are stalactites, the ones hanging from the ceiling, and stalagmites on the floor in the basement of the Lincoln Memorial, several inches long. And Dr. John Whitcomb, in his book, The World That Perished, gives not only a story concerning these, but shows pictures of them in that book. And they're several inches long, and the pictures were made in 1968, which means that from 1923, when the Lincoln Memorial was built, until 1968, these stalactites and stalagmites were formed, not over a period of thousands of years, an inch, 1,000 years for each inch, but rather rapidly. It is not truly sensible and scientific to assume that it took 1,000 years for an inch of a stalactite or a stalagmite to form. Now, there's another one, number 11, that I want you to note, that a stalactite, this is argument number 11, one stalactite is a foot long that is under a railroad bridge in Alliance, Ohio. Now, railroads haven't been around 10,000 years, we know that. But here is a foot-long stalactite hanging under a bridge, so it has been reported, a railroad bridge in Alliance, Ohio. And then something else. There's an article in the book or the publication called Nature that tells of a stalagmite in a lead mine known to be 15 years old. And note this carefully. Now, this is my argument number 12. An article in Nature magazine tells of a stalagmite in a lead mine known to be 15 years old. It was the same in form and height. Now, this stalagmite, remember, is something standing up from the floor, extending upward. And this one was the same in form and height as another stalagmite about which the experts had said it was 220,800 years old. Well, that tells us something too, doesn't it? There's a 5-inch, and this is argument number 13. There's a 5-inch stalactite in what is known as Hetchy Tunnel in California that's less than 20 years old. You might like to have a source on all of these, that is, several of these cases that I've mentioned. If so, then you could read Dr. Eric, E-R-I-C-H, Eric Von, V-O-N, capital V-O-N, and then capital F-A-N-G-E. Dr. Eric Von Fang's well-documented report in the Creation Research Society Journal of June 1974. So these and many others, and I have just barely touched the hem of the garment on evidences that tell us that there's something wrong with the claims of evolutionists regarding the age of the earth. And I do not believe that it is rational or fair or sensible just to ignore these things as though they did not exist. But evolution is in trouble when it confronts the evidences that the earth cannot be as old as they say it is. For remember, for evolution to have occurred, the earth has to be very, very old. If it isn't very, very old, then obviously evolution didn't occur. And furthermore, even if it is proven, or if it can be proven, that the earth is as old as evolutionists say it is, that still would have absolutely nothing to do with whether evolution took place or not. Now we want to study the claims of evolutionists about the evolution of man. Mankind, that is male and female, in the generic sense. The Greeks used the word anthropos to refer to mankind in general. But evolutionists cannot explain. They cannot tell us when the distinction of male and female came about in the evolutionary process, or how it began. Some say people evolved from apes. Others say people and apes evolved from common ancestors. Some will even say that evolutionists do not teach that people evolved from apes. But I hasten to tell you they're wrong about that, because many evolutionists claim this. There is a long list of quotations from evolutionists who say that people have evolved from apes. And if you want to read that list, see Dr. Bolton David Heiser's book, Evolution and Christian Faith, and you can read the list. Dr. David Heiser was an evolutionist while he was a student working on his PhD degree in Johns Hopkins University. after he was graduated and after he received that degree, began to study in more detail and learned that evolution is a hoax. And his book is a classic. It's an education in itself on the subject of evolution, and I recommend it highly. And in it he lists or gives a long list of evolutionists who say that man evolved from apes. Now, of course, some do say that man and apes have common ancestors. But then the evolutionists talk about primates, and these include man and lemurs and apes and monkeys and so on. And evolutionists say that these primates were not quite human. Now, when I said the primates include man, I mean man in the sense that evolutionists here refer to the pre-men, we might say, in the line of evolution. So they say they were not quite human, but they were a little more than being apes. And they have a very few bones of these so-called primates. Very scanty remains have been found. Some of these so-called pre-men or pre-people are given the names: 1, Java man; 2, Cro-Magnon man; then Neanderthal man, and Heidelberg man, and many others. Now, the evidence is good. The evidence is overwhelming that shows these were actually people like modern people. And there's good material on these in books in the bibliography that you receive with this course, and I recommend that you study these in more detail. There's some hoaxes that have been claimed. That is, at first claims were made concerning them as being pre-men or stages in the evolution of man. And one of these hoaxes was what is known as the Piltdown hoax. In England, it was a skeleton that was found by Charles Dawson in 1912. And also Sir Arthur Smith Woodward was in on this find. And it was said that this was the skeleton of a pre-man of some kind, about 200,000 to 1,000,000 years old. And for 40 years, this hoax deceived and misled the best scientists in the world. And finally it was discovered that this skeleton was not even all human. It was made up by pranksters and placed in a gravel pit, you might say, and even contained the bones of some animals, and some think even a dog's bone was in it. And abrasions had been made to make it look older. And the pranksters fooled the scientific world for 40 years. Dr. Louis B. Leakey's find that he calls Zenjanthropus was discovered in the early 1960s, and in the May 1964 Scientific American, maybe his discovery was made a little while before this, I believe, but the announcement was made in 1964 in the Scientific American that Leakey admitted he was wrong. And yet the scientific world hailed it as a great proof that evolution had occurred. I remember one of my professors in one of the universities I attended saw me on the street, and he was so elated over Dr. Louis B. Leakey's find, Zenjanthropus, and said, "Now that is it. That proves that evolution has occurred." Dr. Leakey's own colleagues complained that his find was in the wrong place because it was surrounded by tools that date back just a few thousand years. And so before he died, he admitted he was wrong. He said his find was a sort of pre-man at first that dated to about 1,750,000 years. And finally he decided he was wrong. His son, Dr. Lewis Leakey's son, Richard, later found bones, and Dr. Leakey's find was in Olduvai Gorge in Africa, and his son Richard found some bones later, and he claimed that his bones represented a pre-man of about 3 million years ago. Now this was indeed upsetting and frustrating to evolutionists who had claimed that man evolved about 1 million to 2 million years ago. And it certainly frustrated others for Richard to make this claim because the bones he found were much more like modern man than any of the other prominent pre-men, which were much younger. And yet the bones Richard found were much, much older, according to him, of course. Now this, of course, is just a claim that is not substantiated by true science, just like Donald C. Johansson's find that he called Lucy. And this has been disproved. It's too much like modern people, it has been shown. And according to Johansson, Lucy was even older than the bones that Richard Leakey found. So the evolutionists themselves are not settled on all of these matters. They make all sorts of wild claims, outlandish claims, later to find their claims cannot be substantiated. Another one is called Peking man, or Sinanthropus, since it was found in China near Peking and was supposed to be the bones of pre-men in the evolutionary timetable of about 500,000 years ago, according to Dr. Frederick Zenner. And from my book, I want to read a comment I made on this Peking man. Evolutionists have claimed that Peking man represents a stage in man's evolutionary development that preceded what they call the Neanderthal man. The fossil remains of Peking man were found at Chukotin, China in 1934. These fossil remains disappeared before the Chinese government returned to Peking following the Japanese occupation of that part of China. Authorities feel that evolutionists had good reason to destroy these fossils. Now note why authorities feel that they had good reason to destroy these fossils, that evolutionists had good reason to destroy these fossils. It was because the models allegedly made from them did not correspond with the description of the skulls published by 3 independent eyewitnesses. Now get the point. Here are 3 independent eyewitnesses of these skulls of so-called Sinanthropus or Peking man. And they knew that the models made, that is, models of men that are on display in the museums around the world. And we're told that these are representations of Peking man. But here these 3 eyewitnesses knew that these models could not be the models of Peking man because the skulls would not allow that. And these 3 eyewitnesses, incidentally, were not upstarts. They were not dummies. They were three of the world's greatest authorities in this field. Dr. Marcellin Boule of France, Dr. Teilhard de Chardin of France, and Dr. Abbe Brevel. Dr. Marcellin Boule, or Boule, however his name may be pronounced, it's B-O-U-L-E. Dr. Marcellin Boule is regarded by many as the greatest authority in the world on fossil skulls. Now, there's a report on this from Patrick O'Connell, who was in China from 1924 to 1947, in an article by him entitled "The Peking Man Fraud," and it was in the Bible Science newsletter of July 1969. And in that report, Patrick O'Connell, this China authority, said that several skeletons, now don't fail to get this, several skeletons of modern man were found in the same debris with the so-called bones of Peking man. And these were obviously, these bones of Peking man, he said, were obviously the bones of apes or monkeys. There was a limestone burning process that went on near Chukotin, and there was obviously a great explosion. And the bones of these monkeys and the bones of what we know as modern men were all found in the same debris. But you don't hear the evolutionists telling about the bones of the modern men. They just use the bones of the monkeys, trying to show that they represent some sort of pre-men in the evolutionary line of human beings. I think this is very deceptive. Now, nobody knows what happened to those bones. They're still looking for them. They must have destroyed them or hid them. That is, the bones that allegedly were the remains of Peking man. And they haven't been found yet. And then there was the Nebraska man, so-called Nebraska man. It's hard for you to believe it, perhaps, but they only had one tooth. And it has been reported that this was used in the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee, just a while before I was born, many years ago. And that this so-called evidence of Nebraska man turned out to actually be the tooth of a pig. The tooth of a pig. And then another interesting one was the Colorado man. And it was claimed that the remains found in Colorado were the remains of a sort of pre-man that lived 1,700,000 years ago. And they were very embarrassed when some cowboys came into town and told the good doctors they had made a serious mistake. They had the proof and the evidence that they had buried that monkey 12 years before. So don't believe everything you read about these so-called pre-men. Then the question is raised often, well, what about cavemen? Were there cavemen? Undoubtedly. Cavemen signifies two things. They were men, and they lived in caves. And you know, there are still cavemen. There are still people who live in caves. Should we call them cavemen? Well, it's all right if we want to. They're people, and they live in caves. And the so-called cavemen of the claims of evolutionists are supposed to represent man in his evolutionary development. that he lived in caves in a very primitive stage of his evolutionary development. But the facts are contrary to that, because the facts indicate that these were very intelligent cavemen. If you should go down to El Paso, Texas, and drive south into old Mexico, less than 300 miles, I'm told, into the mountains of north central Mexico, you could find thousands of people living in caves. They're known as the Tarahumara Indians. And one report that I have in my files says, and this was about 20 years ago, that at that time there were 55,000 of them living in these caves. As far as I know, they're still living there, and perhaps even more of them by now. They're very intelligent. They don't know much about the outside world. It's indicated that some of them didn't even know about Mexico City. You know, in a way, they might be better off not to know so much about the outside world. But they're not ignoramuses in the sense of being mentally incompetent. Their knowledge of some things is very limited, but they're very intelligent. And just because they live in caves is no reason to say that they're going through some kind of an evolutionary development. And again, from my book, Evolution in the Light of Scripture, Science, and Sense, I want to read a statement I make regarding this matter. The so-called pre-men, or ape-man types, which evolutionists refer to as evidence of man's evolution, are the product of their fruitful, wishful thinking. In some caves where these alleged pre-men have lived, there is evidence that those who lived in such caves were very skilled and very intelligent. Beautifully sculptured ivory, magnificent colored paintings, including paintings of woolly mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, and fish have been found. Along with the bones of cavemen, the tools for painting and sculpturing have been found. Also, a wide assortment of tools and weapons have been found, such as blades, harpoons, arrows, scrapers, spears, and other items which make it obvious that the so-called pre-men creatures were really just human beings, like modern human beings. And I read a very interesting article a number of years ago, I believe it was in National Geographic's magazine, about how modern scientists are baffled over the inks, the colors used by some of these so-called cavemen in their paintings. And they haven't been able to figure out yet how they made such beautiful colors in these paintings. Well, that shows us that there's a lot of speculation, and sometimes people are deceived by speculations. And I want to read, in closing our study today, some comments from others regarding these so-called pre-men. First, William C. Boyd points out that any idea that human prehistory can be constructed from the fossil record is wishful thinking. Now, Dr. Boyd, I understand, is an evolutionist, but he faces up to reality. And he made this statement on page 324 of his book, Genetics and the Races of Man. Then a man named Franz Weidenreich holds that anatomical evidence offers no alternative. Now, he's talking about the anatomy of the human frame. That anatomical evidence offers no alternative but to unite all the known human fossils and modern man into a single species. He means that the fossils which are alleged to be the remains of some sort of pre-men are really just fossils of human beings. No fossils have been found that represent forms of creatures that were between apes and human beings. I met a distinguished scientist one time at a college in Kentucky, Dr. John Klotz. At that time, he was the only minister in America who was also an American man of science, a very distinguished honor indeed, a very sophisticated position. And Dr. John Klotz wrote many things, and I especially mention his book, Genes, Genesis, and Evolution. It is a very objective book. In reading it, you might think he's presenting the evolutionary cause as though it were true. But then he follows up and shows in his objective manner that it isn't really true, that it is to be called in question, and scientific evidence weighs against it. Dr. Klotz's PhD degree is from the University of Pittsburgh, and he's a very distinguished scientist and scholar. He says in his book on page 132, or rather in not the book I mentioned, but a book edited by Paul Zimmerman in which Dr. Klotz has a chapter, and that book is called Darwin, Evolution, and Creation. And in Dr. Klotz's chapter, he says, among other things, the following words: even the Neanderthal man, about which we know most, is represented by only 13 adult skeletons, in which the skull, the mandible, and some skeletal parts are present. Often the entire find is represented by a piece of skull. Notice that. Or, in the case of the Heidelberg man, by a jawbone. Even to reconstruct the facial skeleton is a very hazardous undertaking. Houghton says, and here Dr. Klotz tells us something that Houghton says, who is an evolutionist, incidentally. Houghton says you can model on a Neanderthal skull either the features of a chimpanzee or those of a philosopher. That is, you can make it look like what you want it to look like. And then Houghton, he says, concludes that the alleged restorations of ancient types of man have very little, if any, scientific value and are likely only to mislead the public. From these outstanding authorities, we see that there are evidences against the claims of the evolution of man made by so many. Next time, we will conclude our study of the evolutionary hypothesis and hopefully get into some other matters, but there are a few other things I want to say about the evolutionary hypothesis, especially on the doctrine that's known as theistic evolution. So we look forward to having you in the next study.